Beelzebub's up on ramps yet again. It's pissing it down as usual. Nothing serious. I'm just doing an oil change. You can just see the remnants just dribbling into the. I've got it's a plastic bucket there. It holds nearly 2 gallons. So you know, a normal, you know, the little tiny things that what they call like a drain can. They're just not enough. It overflows. I do have one, but they only hold about 1 gallon. But I've got paper down here. Any old paper will do, newspaper, wallpaper. This is actually children's artist paper, just to catch any drips. It's actually quite windy. I don't know if you can see it. There are some drips like to the side of the bucket, just down here on the paper, and they'd be all over the pavement. So I do try my hardest to catch all drips, but it's very windy. It's actually the oil was changed in the car in November, and I didn't drive the car for the whole month of November. You know, I had all the camshaft covers off, all the ignition system out, all the fuel injection system out, the breather. You know, it took me 4 weeks in the ice and the snow. It was rather cold, and you know, I did do the oil change, but I didn't drive the car. We were under lockdown here in the UK in that month, and I drove it in December, back and forth to Brighton a couple of times, and but I didn't really drive it at all in January. If you remember, if you saw the previous videos, the car was having new rear and front suspension, so it's actually only done about 1,500 miles on this particular oil. But I am very strict with oil changes, and 1,500 miles is extreme, but it didn't really need it, I suppose. But I just, you know, you can't be overcritical when changing oils. Especially on an old engine that's been stood for years and years and years, you get a lot of sediment sort of built up in the engine, and obviously when an engine's run, things get circulated, but when they stand for days, weeks, months on end, if not years, you do get sediments in the oil ways, and you can flush the engine, put brand new oil in it, and then drive it quite a lot, and that sediment gets released, and it quickly contaminates the fresh oil. Now, this is the 4th oil change. I always use I just use Castrol GTX. It's a nice oil, but it's not terribly expensive. It's perfectly adequate for an old engine like this. And this is the 4th oil change. I've only had the car since July, but this oil is actually quite dark, even though I've only done about 1,500 miles with it. And the very first thing I did when I bought the car, I did an engine flush. I poured flushing sort of properties into the oil. You do not drive it when you've put an engine flush in there. You run it for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, get it nice and hot, but it makes the oil like water. When you open the plug underneath, it just literally just pours out like water. It goes very thin, but it's supposed to loosen any particles that have built up inside the engine. So I did that. Then I did another oil change, which I think I did 2,000 miles with GTX and flushed again. I did it in November, and I'm just doing it again. So there are obviously contaminants and particles inside this engine that are sort of slowly, that have built up a loosening. So I'll just keep flushing it every couple of months with fresh oil until it runs sort of clear when I flush it out. After a couple of thousand miles, it really should run clear when you drain it. And this isn't. It's actually quite dark. We can't crawl under there because it's wet, but the oil is darker than you would expect. I like my oil to come out after about 3,000 or 4,000 miles, and be still very clear. So we'll get there. There's nothing much more you can do to an engine. Obviously coolant's critical. Assuming the coolant is correct and level and we've got no leaks and the engine's being cooled properly, there's nothing much more you can do to preserve the life of an engine than change the oil and filters. Yeah, but people don't seem to realise quite how important it is. What they do, they sort of pull out the dipstick and say, oh yeah, there's oil in there. But that oil might be black. Now, your engine is not going to seize. It will not seize whilst it's got oil in it, even if it's black. But that black oil, it contains a huge amount of carbon. Obviously, bear in mind the internal combustion. Particles of that combustion do contaminate the oil. You get little tiny sort of particles of carbon. and they're actually quite abrasive. So a black oil is actually quite abrasive, so be mindful of that. If you pull your dipstick out and it's dirty, you really need to change it. The engine will not seize, but it will wear. Ideally, you want to see your oil looking nice and amber and golden looking, and if it's dark, do change it. Even if you change it for the cheapest of oil, something you get from the supermarket for, I don't know, you get it ever so cheap, and that would be better to run a really sort of cheap clean oil than an expensive dirty one. And the other thing, yes, I need to mention this on engines that don't get used a lot. So either if the oil is particularly filthy, or possibly the oil might be clean but the engine doesn't get used a lot, and this is a lot of Class 6, you do tend to get like a grey sludge inside the cap. Now, people panic and think that's a failed head gasket. It very well may not be. It happened to my wife a couple of weeks ago, and she was too frightened to tell me, and she thought that her head gasket was gone. But her car doesn't get used on long runs. It's stop, start in Brighton, so the engine never gets hot. Very rarely gets fully hot. Obviously, inside the engine, it's not all oil. The oil mostly is at the bottom of the engine, and there's a lot of fresh air. And fresh air contains moisture. And what happens on an engine that doesn't get used very much, obviously there's air inside the engine gets turned on and it warms up a bit, but it doesn't sort of run enough to blow through all the air through the breather. And some of that air that's got moisture in it remains inside the engine. You turn it off and it condenses, that moisture condenses on the inside of the engine. And it rises to the top. Because it's like a steam, and it collects on the underside of the cap, and that can very quickly create like a grey sludge and be an indication of a head gasket failure. And then you pull out the dipstick, and then there's no contaminant on the dipstick, so that's a little bit confusing. But that's all it is. It's just literally lack of use, and it causes a grey foam. My wife was really upset, and she panicked a bit and thought her head gasket was gone on her Volkswagen. But I looked at it, and it was just that I wiped it out. The car is in need of an oil change, which to be honest, we're unlikely to keep it. We're looking to change it, so we won't do it. But do not panic if you get the grey foam. It's possible that it's just simply lack of use. Obviously, on an engine like this one that gets run for 4 or 5 hours at a time on long runs, it gets fully warmed through, and any possible moisturiser inside the engine, it gets blown through the breather and out, so this one never really gets left for long enough to sort of build up the moisture. But do be mindful of that. If you've got a car that you keep the mileage low on, even if you changed oil recently, you might get that grey foam, which is a bit of a worry. But don't panic, it might not be what you think. But anyway, I'm getting absolutely bloody soaked here. It's raining. I'm just waiting for it to drain through. I'm going to turn the camera off, because what I'm actually going to do whilst I'm waiting for the engine to drain through, I'm going to take out each spark plug. They were done in November, they were brand new in November. I'm just going to take them out, clean them, check the gaps. But I always put a little tiny bit of high temperature copper grease just on the thread. Aluminium engines are a bit of a devil for you can't really tighten them up very much, because you can easily shear the thread, but they're a bit of a devil for corroding slightly, and they can be difficult to undo. So, but it has to be high temperature copper grease, not just the regular copperies. The high temperature one, I think it's about 370 degrees centigrade. It's quite hot, so it survives. So I'll do that whilst we're waiting for this to drain. And I've got a brand new filter. That's always a bit of a messy job, because it sits sort of sideways on the engine. When you undo it, it pedals out the side, it goes everywhere and all down your arms. But they're much easier if they sit upside down like this. But on the Jag here, it sits sideways on the block, and as you can imagine, you're undoing it, and it does leak quite a lot. So I've got paper down here. I'll make sure the paper's in the right position, because it will leak everywhere. Anyway, so I'm just going to do that whilst the engine drains. So I'm going to do the spark plugs, but I'm not going to do that on camera.